Hi, in this video we're going to be looking at the Romantic period. But before we start looking at that period specifically, I want to say something about how we should conceptualize that period. I understand that there's a tendency to see something that happened long before our great-grandparents were born as something long, long ago and far, far away. And something like Game of Thrones or Star Wars or something that happened in a galaxy distant in the past. But I think that's a real mistake. And one of the reasons it's such a big mistake is that many of the problems that our forefathers, or at least Britain's forefathers, encountered in this particular period and then through the 19th century were many of the same problems that we're still dealing with today. And I think it's really important we understand the continuity between their time and ours, because not only does it help us see their problems as real social problems that we deal with, but it also helps us understand our own social problems and where they came from. Many of the problems, for example, that Dickens deals with in his issues of social justice, because he was highly concerned with social justice, and his methods of dealing with those problems through his literature, come forward today in many cultural battles over what is sometimes called cancel culture. The idea that we are supposed to use the media to control how people see social problems. And that's just one of the many problems that people are grappling with in this particular period. There's a tremendous problem we'll be seeing in the Romantic period. One of the biggest problems is the tremendous gap in wealth between the rich and the very poor. Something that Benjamin Disraeli, famous British novelist and prime minister, called the two nations. This idea that there are two separate Englands. There's the England occupied by the wealthy, and then a very different England occupied by the poor, and the different kinds of social justice that they could expect. That was a problem that was very real for those people as it is now. They also had the problems of disease, of urban decay, of crime, of poverty. All of these are problems that they're dealing with, and how to handle those. The problems of big government versus laissez-faire economics that are currently being battled out in our own Congress and in the media between government control and deregulation. That was very, very real to people at the beginning of the 19th century, and it was a big discussion that we'll be looking at as we talk about the difference between the utilitarians, who ultimately became our conservatives, but were then called the radicals, and their conservatives that we would now think of as liberals interested in welfare and social justice. There's also problems with the notion of empire and globalism. Those are problems we're dealing with now, and those are problems that were very real to England of the 19th century, especially the end of the 19th century. When we look at William Conrad, William Conrad is a long-dead actor. Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness, where he's talking about the attempts of what we would now call cultural imperialism, of which not only real imperialism, but also cultural imperialism is taking place, and the attempts to sort of cover it over with a thin brush of philanthropy. Also, the ideas of corrupting literature. We'll see that as early as Wordsworth. Wordsworth attempting to explain how the popular literature of the time are corrupting the influences of a new literary class. So these are real problems for those people, just as they're problems for us, and I think it's important to understand the continuity. All right, so now we're going to start looking at the Romantic period. When we're talking about the Romantic period and Romanticism, we're talking about a period that dates roughly from 1789 to 1832. Now, those dates are to some extent arbitrary. It's not like people suddenly woke up on July 14th, 1789 and said, "Oh, yesterday I felt very neoclassical, but somehow today I feel much more romantic." And 1832, all of a sudden they threw a party and said, "Well, Romanticism is over, we're going to be Victorians now." And suddenly put on long frocks and heavy scarves and things like that. So to some extent it's arbitrary, but also the divisions are very real, because they're important things that happened on these dates that really demarcated a change in English culture that allows us to track the shift from the Romantic period to the Victorian period, and from the Augustan period in the 18th century into the Romantic period. Although there was a lot of continuity, obviously, there also were some very significant changes. The Romantic period runs from 1789 to 1832, as I just suggested. Some historical reference points, just to kind of establish where we are in English and world history. From the end of the 1700s, the 18th century, all the way through 1820, the King of England was George III. George III, you will remember from your American history course as the king who was in charge of England during the American Revolution. But between 1811 and 1820, George III was judged insane. He was incapable of fulfilling his duties, and there are a number of reasons that have been hypothesized for his problems, among them bipolar disorder. But he was incapable, or depression. He was incapable of ruling the country. So from 1811 to 1820, England was under the regency, the Prince Regent. The Prince Regent who would ultimately become George IV when George III died. When he became the Prince Regent, he was quite young, and the country was run by royal advisors until he came of age. And then when George IV died, he became king. When George III died, he became George IV. During the Regency, the most famous things that take place during the Regency, of course, are the Regency England is very closely associated with Jane Austen, and sort of Regency culture was something that Jane Austen is representing in her novels. George IV ruled until 1830, at which time he was replaced by William IV, his brother, who ruled until 1837, and when he died, Queen Victoria took over. It's interesting that we judge the end of the Romantic period and the beginning of the Victorian period in 1832, not 1837, when Victoria actually took over. But there's a reason for that, and that is because one of the most significant political changes in English history took place in 1832 with the passage of the first Reform Bill that changed English society in very significant ways, or at least codified changes that had taken place in English society in very significant ways. All right, so what unifies this period between 1789 and 1832, and what do the poets that we see during this time have in common? And what they have in common is this whole notion of revolution. This is a period of significant revolution. And we'll be looking at all the different aspects of this revolution. And the people who were writing during this period saw themselves very much as a part of this revolution and engaged in this millennial activity. So, what are the different elements of the revolution? Well, part of the revolution is political revolution. I mean, actual, literal revolution. We all know in 1776, we celebrate it with the 4th of July, was the American Revolution. And at this particular point, the colonies were throwing off what they felt was unfair representation by the crown. And so already there's this notion of this democratic revolution being established with the American revolutionaries following Thomas Paine and others writing about individual freedom. Well, shortly after that, we have in 1789 the sort of formal beginning of the French Revolution with the fall of the Bastille, the storming and fall of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, which the French celebrate as their Independence Day, Bastille Day. So there's very much an era of revolution going on. And that era of revolution is taking place in England as well. During this same period, England is very concerned about its own eruption into popular revolution, and that they would have their own democratic revolution throwing off the monarchy in favor of more democratic principles. And in fact, in 1795, Parliament, under the auspices of the king, enacted the Treason Act, or rather rejuvenated the Treason Act, which had been around since the first English Revolution in the 1600s. But they rejuvenated it, and among those things, George IV was sort of stoned by a mob. His carriage was stoned by a mob, which frightened George and helped him sponsor this act. But also among those things that could be punished by the Treason Act were acts of sedition. And acts of sedition could be challenging or undermining faith in the monarchy, challenging or undermining faith in the English government. And in fact, because remember, England has a state religion, the Church of England. Challenging the dogma of the Church of England could be seen as sedition and could get you punished. Among the least serious punishments were 7 years of transportation, which meant that you were sent away to Australia, basically transported to Australia or America, and usually put to work for 7 years. You were exiled, and could range up to, if your act of treason or sedition was governed serious enough, it could go to capital punishment. Among the acts of sedition you could be engaged in was something called machine breaking, and we'll be talking about what machine breaking means. But basically, it means destroying the industrial machinery, specifically the steam looms, that were taking over a lot of the cottage labor. The reason that the machine breaking became a punishment, an act worthy of capital punishment, was because of the tremendous social unrest by the workers who were being displaced and were not being adequately taken care of as they sunk further and further into poverty. And we'll talk about that later. But in 1819, the famous Peterloo Massacre, which took place in Manchester at St. Peter's Field, where 60,000, which is a significant number of people, gathered in St. Peter's Fields in Manchester and were charged by English soldiers who fired upon them, killing a significant number of people and wounding many others. And so there was this real concern about political revolution taking place at this time. Along with the political revolution, maybe causing the political revolution, was a tremendous amount of social revolution that was taking place. A lot of the social revolution has to do with the rapid shift of English society as a result of the Industrial Revolution. In 1765, Scotsman James Watt perfected the steam engine. Now, the steam engine had been around for a while sort of as a curiosity, but he turned it into a viable form of power for industry and made possible the growth of the modern factory. And so what happened as a result of that is many of the industries that had taken place, many industries that people had engaged in for their support during the 1800s and back for millennia, had been cottage industries. Basically, people would grow wool, and they'd weave the wool into cloth, and they'd sew the cloth into clothing, and then they'd exchange clothing with other people, or they'd barter for clothing. A lot of those acts of cottage industry were now being taken over, especially weaving was being taken over by big industry, putting a lot of people out of their ability to support themselves. There was this massive shift during this time from an agrarian to an industrial economy. So this is a tremendous, significant shift, because in an agrarian society, people had been living in the same villages for generations. Many of these people had been living in the same farms, working the same farms that their grandparents worked and were born in, and their parents were born in, and they were born in, living in the same place with the same neighbors for literally generations. Newcomers in these villages had been people whose families had moved in 200 years ago. They would be considered relative newcomers. And the way the agrarian economy worked is that you basically had a subsistence income or subsistence economy. You grew enough to support yourself, to pay your rent to the person who owned your land, because you were most likely a tenant farmer, to give 10% of your income to the church, tithing, and then the minuscule bit that was left over that you didn't need to actually survive yourself, you traded, you bartered with others in your community for other goods. So someone might have sheep and they would weave wool into cloth, and then they would sell the cloth. They'd barter the cloth to a tailor who would make it into clothing, and then you would trade food or firewood or whatever it was for clothing. And so there's this sort of cottage industry supporting everything. So this is all of a sudden, all of these cottage industries are being disrupted by big industry. Another way that this contributed to the disruption of traditional agrarian life was that we now have a tremendous number of workers immigrating to the industrial centers, to the cities. And this was facilitated, or pardon, facilitated, it was forced by a process that was known as enclosure. And what enclosure was, the acts of enclosure enacted by Parliament, was they were taking what had before been common lands, public lands accessible to the people of the village, who would use them for raising sheep or cattle or growing crops or growing gardens and supporting their subsistence economy, were now being taken away and given to large estates. The purpose of this was because these large estates were supposed to engage in what we would think of as large-scale farming, a sort of their version of factory farming, because small family-operated farms simply couldn't grow crops at the scale needed in order to support all of the new industrial economy and all of the people who were now moving to the cities. And so they needed to make their farming much more efficient, and the only way you could do that was on large-scale farming. And so they went through this process of enclosure where they took away these common lands people had lived in for centuries and used and worked for centuries, and they gave them to the large landowners to grow to grow their crops on a larger scale, which meant that all these workers were now displaced from their homes. They had no way to survive. And there's a famous Thomas Gray poem called The Deserted Village from the end of the 1700s, in which he talks about this village that has now just been vacated because all these people have moved away from what was once a, if not wealthy, at least thriving agrarian economy, and now have been displaced to go to the city. So what goes along with this, of course, then is this mass worker migration into industrial centers. People who had lived for generations now are collecting in new industrial centers like Manchester, Birmingham, and London. London, of course, had always been a relatively speaking, big city, but Manchester and Birmingham had been sleepy little villages that all of a sudden became almost within years, a few years, these big burgeoning industrial centers. Because they were located near the natural resources and the shipping resources. Liverpool also, because it was a shipping source, place where they could distribute things easily across the English Channel and across the ocean. They suddenly attracted these huge population centers. Just for example, London in 1650, at the way back in the 17th century, had a population of 350,000. By 1700, that had doubled to 700,000. But by 1821, that had doubled again to almost 1.4 million. And then it would go on to almost double again by, 1881. It's 3.8 million. So London is growing exponentially, and that's creating all sorts of new social problems. And for example, many of the problems that we recognize now were really becoming serious problems then. These are problems associated with mass urban growth. Among those problems are, among other things, that there's this problem of all these people moving from farms and villages that they'd occupied for centuries next to neighbors, next to whom they had lived for centuries, were now moving into these huge urban centers and living in brand new row houses that had been thrown up overnight with next to people they didn't know and would never know because they never had a chance. The working day or the work week at that time didn't give them much chance to socialize. A normal work day was 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and half days on Sunday. So people could go to church, but you work 7 days a week. Now, part of the problem, and also, by the way, children worked as well. And it's because very often social changes don't keep up with economic changes. And so in an agrarian society, kids are able to work. They can work on a farm. I mean, they can do minor tasks. They can feed the chickens, and they can weed gardens, and they can pick apples or pick fruit that are growing in the gardens. So you can send kids off or collect eggs. So you can send kids off to do minor, relatively easy chores. When the industrialization happened, there were no laws protecting children from work, and so children were put to work in the mines. They were put to work in the factories. There was no reason, really, that they couldn't work. And we'll talk a little bit later about how laissez-faire capitalism, which was growing at this time, supported that notion. So it wasn't until in the mid-1800s, 1830s, that the first child labor laws were enacted. And up until that time, children were crawling through mines on their hands and knees through shafts that were too small to admit adults, hauling ore carts behind them, naked. They would, and not coming out into the light of day for months at a time. And of course, as a result of that, as a result of black lung and accidents in the mines, their mortality rate was incredibly high. It's unthinkable horror to us now, but no one really thought about it then. It took a while for people to think that, ooh, wow, this worked for the farm, but it doesn't really work for a mine. So we had a problem with alienation and social disconnection, but also this problem of sort of uncomfortable is bad, inhospitable living conditions. On top of that, we have instant slums. These new cities threw up row houses to accommodate the workers on a tremendous scale. They just built them without bothering to build the infrastructure to support them. So there's no water supplies, there's no adequate sewage drainage. The sewage was draining down the middle of the street, and living situations were simply horrible, which we'll talk about in a little bit longer. So there's this instant slums and urban decay. Almost as quickly as they're building the cities, they're turning into slums. And some of the slums that Dickens describes in the 1800s in London, Seven Dials, for example, had conditions that I think that we can hardly imagine. In addition to that, there's, of course, we're talking about the slums. In addition to that, obviously the people occupying the slums are in conditions of tremendous poverty. There is no social safety net. People are moving to the cities to get jobs in the factories, but there are more people moving than there are jobs in the factories, and there's nothing for them to rely upon to make up for that. So there's traditionally charity in English society, but handled by the parish. The parish was the religious and political sector, geographic area, and everyone who lived in that area worked and gave 10% of their income to the church, and it was called tithing, right? And then the church used part of that to maintain the church and part of it to pay the minister, and part of that was then used as alms to give to the poor. So if you were a widow who was no longer able to support yourself, you could go to the church and they would give you alms to survive on. Or if you were a farmer who was injured or got sick and couldn't work your land, your neighbors would help you, but you would also rely on alms from the church. But of course, everyone had moved away, and now they're all packed into these cities, and there's no more parish, or at least there's no parish with the resources to support these people. So there's no social safety net. There are not enough jobs, and there's nothing to fall back on when you don't have a job. Plus, also, the industrial conditions were incredibly dangerous. The steam-driven looms had huge flywheels that were spinning at high rates of speed, and if you inattentively stuck your hand in the wrong place, your hand would get cut off, usually torn off, a serious injury. And if you managed to survive that, obviously you couldn't work because you were now what they would call crippled. That's the terminology they would use at the time. And you were, as a cripple, you were unable to work, and there was nothing for you to do for support except for stand in the street and beg and eventually die of some horrific disease or starvation. Which, of course, then suggests the next problem, the problem of crime. Because there's so many people without work, so many people crammed together in these close quarters, so many people who were in desperate need, that many of them were forced to fall back on crime for support. And so crime was rampant on a scale that had never before been seen, and the society just wasn't able to deal with it. The first modern police force, the Metropolitan Police Force in London, was founded in 1832. Also, of course, all these people crammed together in living conditions, in insupportable living conditions with not adequate infrastructure and sewage just running through the streets, and people being crammed together were inadequately fed and completely cleaned. I mean, obviously, modern hygiene didn't exist at that time, resulted in tremendous amounts of disease. And so, in these metropolitan centers, these huge industrial centers in London would be swept at regular intervals by cholera and typhoid epidemics, which would kill hundreds of thousands of people at a time. So this mass urbanization brought with it a number of social problems that were causing what appeared to be the complete disruption of English society, bringing about the need for all sorts of social change and revolution. On top of that, there's this issue of the economics of the thing and the politics of the circumstances. The dominant political theory, starting with the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, and really taking over in the middle of the 19th century, is what is known as laissez-faire economics, this idea of let alone. Laissez-faire translates from French into let alone, which is essentially the idea of deregulation, the idea that economics will take care of social problems, that people will, following Adam Smith and the iron hand of necessity, people will seek their own self-interest. And in pursuing their best interests, they'll maximize their best interest. Another problem that was causing this social disruption is this idea of disenfranchisement, of people not getting to vote. And one of the reasons for that was that voting was based upon property ownership, or at least property control. So you had to own property. The rules varied from precinct to precinct, from parish to parish across England, but for the most part, the basic idea was that you either had to own property or you had to have some sort of durable leasehold on property worth a certain amount of money. Then you were able to vote. But the vast majority of people didn't own property, or they didn't have, they were renting a short-term rent, or they were at will residents, meaning that they could be thrown off at any point by the landowner, and those people couldn't vote, which was the majority of people in England were unable to vote. Also, there was this other problem called rotten boroughs or pocket boroughs that was taking place, which was as a result of the emptying of the countryside because of enclosure and because of the growth of industrial centers and the move away from an agrarian society. There were boroughs, political boroughs, were political precincts that were depopulated. Basically, the whole borough was just simply occupied by the landowner, and then he could either represent himself or appoint people who depended upon him for their income and their livelihood to serve in Parliament. And as I'm sure you know, Parliament has the ancestral House of Lords, the peers, the people who inherit their seat in the House of Lords, and then the House of Commons, who are elected by the people. But a significant number of these, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about the Reform Bill of 1832, a significant number of the seats in Parliament were actually controlled by the wealthy landowners who happened to be the people in the House of Lords. So there really wasn't a popular government. And there was a tremendous amount of concern. Concern is a weak word for it. There was a tremendous amount of revolutionary fervor because of the lack of representative government in England. And there was a tremendous concern that this revolutionary fervor would boil over, as it had in France, into an actual popular revolution. On top of that, there is the significant change in religion and religious beliefs. Although the shift away from deeply held religious beliefs won't really manifest itself fully until the middle of the 1800s, there's already this movement among the intellectual elite people, the educated people, sort of away from dogmatic or doctrinal belief systems. And among those people we run into as Romantic poets, there was really a tendency to reject traditional notions of religion, ranging from Blake's complete belief in God, but his failure to believe in the dogma of Christianity, to Shelley's atheism. So there is a rejection of religion. And this is taking place because of the growth of the Enlightenment philosophies and rationalism, and also the new interest in what is now becoming known as science. The term science is now finally coming into vogue. Before it just sort of meant knowledge. The word science has been around, but before it meant knowledge. And now we begin to think of it in the terms more like we think of now, which is experimentation and discovery and related to technology, sort of the modern sense of science. And we can see this in Frankenstein, for instance, which begins with a preface in which Mary Shelley talks overtly about the new interest in science and how that motivates her belief that life might be able to be created, and also Victor Frankenstein's creation. So this provokes a change in a revolutionary change in English society that's taking place at this particular time. In the next video, we'll take a look at how the Romantic writers responded to this social situation.